If you think modern family drama is complicated, wait until you hear what happened behind the palace doors of Europe's royal daughters. Tonight, we drift into a strange and solemn chapter of European history, a tale whispered in palace halls and hidden behind brocade curtains. It's a story not of wars or conquests, but of genetics, isolation, and the unintended consequences of royal obsession with bloodlines. It's the story of Europe's royal daughters, born into power, but often prisoners of their own family trees. For centuries, kings and queens across Europe clung to the idea of pure blood. Royal lineage wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a political weapon. To protect it, families married within the dynasty, cousins, uncles, nieces, and sometimes siblings. The goal was simple: keep the land and titles intact. But the price? That was paid, quietly and tragically, by the next generation. Especially the women. While the kings led armies and signed treaties, the daughters were handed over like royal currency. Their purpose was clear: secure alliances through marriage, produce heirs, and maintain appearances. But beneath the silk gowns and jeweled tiaras, many of these women suffered. Some were born with visible deformities. Others carried invisible burdens: infertility, mental illness, early death. This isn't a dramatic story filled with rebellion or scandal. It's quieter, slower. It's about the silent toll of centuries-old traditions, the women whose names you may have never heard, the portraits that never tell the full story. So tonight, we journey gently through the corridors of time. We'll meet royal daughters from Spain, Austria, France, Britain, Russia, and beyond, each one shaped by bloodlines that were too tightly woven. Some lived in pain. Some died young. Others bore children only to lose them. Their lives were not their own, but tonight, we'll remember them. So take a deep breath. Let the sound of history guide you. Imagine candlelight dancing on painted ceilings, the soft creak of wooden floors in old palaces, the distant echo of harpsichords. You're safe now, and as the story unfolds, you may find yourself drifting, slowly, gently, into sleep. To understand the consequences of inbreeding in Europe's royal daughters, we must begin with the Habsburgs, a dynasty infamous for marrying within its own ranks. The Habsburgs ruled over vast territories: Spain, Austria, Hungary, and more. They believed deeply in dynastic purity and political control. Marrying a cousin or niece was considered not taboo, but necessary, and perhaps no family paid a higher price. Much has been said about Charles II of Spain, born at the end of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. His lower jaw jutted out so far he couldn't chew. He struggled to speak clearly, suffered from seizures, and was described as both physically and mentally feeble. He was sterile, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. But Charles wasn't alone. The daughters of the Habsburgs were also victims of this genetic isolation. Consider Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain. She is immortalized in the famous painting Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, a beautiful, delicate girl surrounded by attendants. What the painting doesn't show is her fate. At 15, she was married to her uncle, Emperor Leopold I of Austria. Their union was political. They had 4 children. Only one survived infancy. Margarita died at 21, worn out by childbirth and illness. Then there was Maria Anna of Austria, born in 1683. She married her maternal uncle King John V of Portugal. The match was arranged for diplomacy, not love. She bore several children, but suffered from frail health throughout her life. Portraits often flattered her appearance, but written records hint at her chronic fatigue and nervous ailments. Another example is Maria Theresa of Spain, not to be confused with the Empress of Austria. She married Louis XIV of France. Their union was meant to unite the French and Spanish crowns. Though she gave birth to 6 children, only one lived beyond infancy. Each pregnancy was harder than the last, and she died young, exhausted and broken. These women, daughters of kings and queens, had no control over their fate. They were not asked, they were expected. Their health did not matter, their happiness was irrelevant. Their bloodlines, however, were sacred. And so, generation after generation, the Habsburg daughters were married into the same few families, their genes crisscrossing, until the damage could no longer be ignored. Among the grand imperial halls of Vienna, one woman shaped the future of Europe through her daughters, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. She gave birth to 16 children, 11 of them girls. And while their names may not be as famous as their brother, Joseph II, or their sister Marie Antoinette, each played a role in the royal web of 18th-century Europe. Maria Theresa once said, "I must make use of my daughters," and she did. Each one was a piece in her political puzzle. Let's begin with Maria Carolina, She was married off to Ferdinand I of Naples and Sicily. Carolina was strong-willed and politically astute, but her life was a series of miscarriages, illnesses, and childbirths. She bore 18 children, several of whom died young. Her health declined in later years. She suffered from recurring migraines, and was eventually confined to her chambers due to mental fatigue and depression. Another sister, Maria Amalia, was married to Ferdinand, Duke of Parma. She had a more rebellious spirit and clashed with her mother over her arranged marriage. After the wedding, she lived a relatively secluded life. She reportedly suffered from anxiety and depression, worsened by her sense of exile from the Viennese court. And then there's Marie Antoinette, the most famous of Maria Theresa's daughters. As a young girl, Marie suffered from dental issues, likely a remnant of Habsburg traits. When she arrived in France at the age of 14, she was criticized for her appearance, her posture, even the shape of her mouth. Her early letters show signs of deep insecurity and nervous tension. She lived under immense pressure to conceive, facing public scrutiny when her first pregnancy didn't happen right away. Though she is remembered for extravagance, her private life was often filled with loneliness, fatigue, and a longing for affection. She gave birth to 4 children. 2 died in childhood. The physical toll of childbirth, combined with the emotional weight of her public role and eventual imprisonment, wore her down. Maria Theresa's daughters were not raised to rule, but to marry. Their bodies were tools of diplomacy. Whether they liked their husbands, whether they were healthy, whether they survived childbirth, these were secondary concerns. The Austrian court glittered on the surface. Beneath the chandeliers and operas were women suffering quietly, often dismissed as hysterical, moody, or ungrateful. But they were bearing the weight of centuries of dynastic ambition. The halls of Versailles shimmered with crystal chandeliers, fountains, and elaborate gowns. But beneath the powdered wigs and whispered court intrigue, the women of France's Bourbon dynasty lived with the silent toll of royal bloodline preservation. Let us begin with Louise Elisabeth of France, eldest daughter of Louis XV. Known as Madame Infante, she was married off at age 12 to Philip, Duke of Parma, her first cousin. The match was designed to tighten alliances with Spain. The physical consequences of cousin marriage weren't immediately obvious in her, but her children would not be so fortunate. One of her sons had a hunchback, and one of her daughters was reportedly born with a facial deformity that was retouched in portraits. Louise Elizabeth herself suffered greatly from homesickness, mood disorders, and miscarriages. Her letters reveal a woman trying to survive court life, writing longingly of Versailles while trapped in Parma. She died at 32 of smallpox, weakened by years of stress and childbirth. Then there's Marie Adelaide of Savoy, mother of Louis XV. Though she escaped overt signs of inbreeding, her early death from measles at age 26 while pregnant was seen as a tragic blow. Like many royal women, she was overworked as a mother and court figure, having multiple children in quick succession. 3 of her children died before age 5. Her own health, weakened by childbirth and constant palace travel, never recovered. And of course, Marie Antoinette, whom we revisited in Chapter 2, carried the psychological legacy of cousin marriages. Her bloodline came from generations of Habsburg intermarriage, which led to congenital jaw issues, dental deformities, and probable hormonal imbalances. Marie's first pregnancy took 8 years to produce a viable heir. This was blamed on her, not her husband Louis XVI, who may have suffered from phimosis, a condition likely caused by intergenerational genetic problems, making intimacy difficult. The blame fell on Marie. The pressure was unbearable. When she did give birth, her children were public property. The deliveries were often performed in front of spectators. The anxiety of pregnancy, combined with public performance, took a psychological toll. After losing her first daughter and second son, Marie wrote that she felt an emptiness no crown could fill. Even noble women outside the immediate royal line, like Madame Elizabeth, sister to Louis XVI, struggled with mysterious fevers, chronic illnesses, and reclusive behavior. Though revered for her stoicism, many believe she suffered from a hormonal or autoimmune disorder that may have been inherited. The Bourbon brides weren't just fashion icons, they were survivors of dynastic marriages, of overbearing expectations, of court intrigue, and often, of inherited fragility. While their lives glowed on canvas, they quietly withered in real life. While Britain practiced less intermarriage than some European courts, their royals were far from immune to the effects of consanguinity. Instead of generations of cousin marriages, they favored strategic marriages to German and Danish relatives. Still a limited pool of noble genetics. It all crystallizes in the figure of Queen Victoria, who married her first cousin Prince Albert. Their match was passionate and politically celebrated, but genetically complicated. Victoria was a carrier of the haemophilia gene, which would devastate generations of European royals. Among their daughters, Princess Alice stands out. Alice had a strong moral compass and deep sense of duty, but her physical health was fragile. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and bore 7 children. 3 of them died young, including her son Friedrich, who inherited haemophilia and bled to death after a minor fall. Alice never recovered emotionally. Alice died of diphtheria at 35, shortly after one of her daughters died from the same illness. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that her family was trying to hide symptoms from each other in quarantine. The combination of grief, genetic fragility, and isolation became a defining trait of her short, painful life. Her daughter, Princess Alix, later Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, carried the haemophilia gene into the Romanov dynasty. Her son, Alexei, became the poster child of royal haemophilia, but Alexandra herself suffered deeply. She experienced fainting spells, spiritual paranoia, and what would now be diagnosed as severe anxiety and depression. Many of her symptoms worsened after childbirth. The British royal daughters continued to reflect the consequences of Victoria and Albert's union. Princess Helena, another daughter, struggled with reproductive issues and was addicted to laudanum, a morphine-based tincture common at the time for pain and hysteria. She was once described as always exhausted, always irritable. Then there was Princess Louise, the artistic daughter. She defied tradition, remaining unmarried longer than expected, and rumored to have had affairs. But behind her progressive reputation, Louise also lived with chronic joint pain and digestive problems, issues she shared with other descendants of Queen Victoria, including King Edward VII. The combination of close genetics and the suppression of emotion created a pattern among British royal daughters: strong appearances, hidden suffering. They were well-dressed, well-educated, and well-mannered, but many were also physically weak, emotionally burdened, and painfully aware that their role was not to be happy, but to be useful. If the Habsburgs were the architects of royal inbreeding, then Spain was their most afflicted palace. The Spanish court took consanguinity to extremes: uncle-niece marriages, repeated cousin pairings, and zero genetic diversity for nearly 2 centuries. Let's revisit Infanta Margarita Teresa, painted famously in Las Meninas. Her sweet doll-like appearance concealed a dark truth. She was both niece and wife to Emperor Leopold I. Their family tree was so entangled that many branches merged. Margarita was described as intelligent and vivacious, but her body was frail, her spine was twisted, and she had difficulty walking in later life. Pregnancy after pregnancy took a toll. She delivered 4 children in 6 years. 3 died in infancy. The strain killed her at 21. Her death was not a shock. It was seen as an accepted outcome of royal duty. Then there's Maria Anna of Neuburg, Queen of Spain, and second wife to Charles II. She wasn't a Habsburg herself, but married into the family's final chapter. Desperate to produce an heir, Maria Anna underwent bizarre fertility rituals, including prayers to saints, special diets, and near-constant medical observation. She reportedly suffered from mysterious abdominal pain, depression, and fainting spells. Her letters, rare and guarded, describe feelings of loneliness, pressure, and humiliation. She and Charles had no children. Charles's infertility, a product of generations of inbreeding, led to the War of Spanish Succession. But long before the war, Spanish princesses suffered in silence. Infanta Maria Josefa was reportedly born with fused toes and bowed legs. She was hidden from the public eye and eventually died from pneumonia before marriage. She was 19. And Maria Antonia of Austria, married to the Bavarian elector, was described as delicate and nervous. She suffered multiple miscarriages, likely due to a genetic blood clotting disorder. She died in childbirth at 23. The tragedy of Spain's royal daughters wasn't just in their early deaths, it was in their powerlessness. They were born to serve the dynasty, not to live full lives. Medical care was rudimentary, privacy didn't exist, their bodies were scrutinized, their cycles tracked, and their value defined by fertility. In time, the line ended. The Spanish Habsburgs collapsed not with a war, but with a whimper, a family so tangled in its own blood that it couldn't survive. The imperial palaces of Russia were among the grandest in Europe, vast halls of gold leaf, marble staircases, and candlelit ballrooms. But beneath this magnificence lay a dynasty fraught with spiritual desperation, chronic illness, and genetic inheritance passed down through the veins of queens and princesses. And at the heart of it all were the Romanov daughters. Our story in Russia begins with Alexandra Feodorovna, born as Princess Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She carried the infamous hemophilia gene, the same mutation that had plagued her brother Friedrich, and now threatened her only son, Tsarevich Alexei. Alexandra's marriage to Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, was a love match, but her life was anything but easy. Living in the isolated splendor of the Russian court, Alexandra struggled with depression, anxiety, and a deeply ingrained sense of spiritual guilt. She believed her son's suffering was divine punishment, and that only God, or someone touched by God, could help. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the mystic healer. Alexandra clung to Rasputin, not out of delusion, but out of desperation. Every time Alexei bled, she feared for his life. And every time Rasputin's presence seemed to bring recovery, she believed he was heaven-sent. Her daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, grew up in this environment of anxiety and religious fervor. Though these grand duchesses were not victims of overt inbreeding, they bore the psychological legacy. The fear of death was constant. They were barred from rigorous physical activity, kept in protective isolation, and raised under the suffocating weight of a mother's panic and a nation's expectations. Olga, the eldest, showed early signs of melancholy. Letters from her nurses and tutors suggest she was often withdrawn, tired, and prone to long moods. Tatiana, known as the most disciplined, struggled with intense migraines and tension. Maria, the most sociable, was described as overly sensitive and easily hurt. Anastasia, lively and mischievous, often hid her own anxiety behind humor. When the revolution came, the entire family was imprisoned. Even then, Alexandra clung to prayer. Her daughters, raised in luxury, now slept on iron cots, their futures crumbling with the empire. In their final moments in the basement of the Ipatiev house, the daughters of Russia, once heirs to one of the most powerful empires on earth, were cut down not by enemies alone, but by the consequences of silence, bloodlines, and a world unwilling to change. In contrast to the grandeur of France and Russia, Denmark's royal court was quieter, more modest, but no less burdened by duty and expectation. The Danish royals were known for their strategic marriages, often sending their daughters into courts far grander and more volatile than their own. And though they didn't practice extreme inbreeding, the genetic echo of European royal entanglements still rippled through their line. One of the most tragic figures was Princess Thyra of Denmark, the youngest daughter of King Christian IX. Thyra was bright and well-educated, but her life took a turn when, at age 19, she became pregnant out of wedlock, an unthinkable scandal in a devout Lutheran court. Rather than allow the child to be born in public disgrace, Thyra was sent into seclusion. She gave birth secretly, and the child was placed for adoption in London. Thyra never saw her daughter again. The event left a lasting emotional scar. She married later than her sisters to the Duke of Cumberland, but struggled with chronic nervous conditions for the rest of her life, likely a mixture of trauma, repressed grief, and emotional isolation. Her sister, Alexandra of Denmark, fared differently, at least publicly. She married the future King Edward VII of Britain, and became a beloved queen. But Alexandra's life was also marked by chronic illness. She suffered from rheumatic fever in her youth, which left her with a lifelong limp and frequent episodes of joint pain. Despite being admired for her beauty and grace, Alexandra's health declined in private. She became partially deaf, often struggled with fatigue, and withdrew from public life more and more as she aged. Like many royal women, she put on a brave face, an image of perfection, while hiding immense physical discomfort. Another sister, Dagmar of Denmark, became Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia, mother of Nicholas II. Her story, like that of her son and daughter-in-law, ended in revolution and exile. Though physically strong, Dagmar spent her later years in mourning, grieving the deaths of her husband, son, and grandchildren, all executed during the Russian Revolution. The daughters of Denmark may have escaped the worst of genetic inbreeding, but they were still royal women in a world that did not value their autonomy. They were exported to foreign lands, expected to uphold tradition, and carry the emotional weight of entire nations on their shoulders. For every famous princess, there were dozens more whose names have been forgotten, tucked away in family archives, buried in quiet churchyards, or remembered only in faded portraits. These women were born into minor courts, duchies, electorates, and principalities, where power was limited but expectations remained high. In Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire fractured into countless small states, inbreeding among noble houses was rampant. One example is Princess Anna of Saxony, who married into the House of Orange in the Netherlands. From her letters, historians have gleaned a portrait of a deeply unhappy woman. She suffered from melancholia, what we now recognize as clinical depression. She frequently took to her bed for weeks, suffered violent mood swings, and eventually attempted suicide. Her condition was dismissed as weakness. She was replaced, ignored, and eventually institutionalized, but her son, Maurice of Nassau, would later write that his mother had a mind too tender for court life. In Bavaria, Duchess Sophie Charlotte was admired for her intellect and musical talent, but she too bore the hidden weight of genetic frailty. After marrying into the Prussian royal family, she suffered multiple miscarriages. Her court physician noted an imbalance of the humors and prescribed mercury and cold baths. Neither helped. Other lesser-known women were simply erased. Princess Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a cousin to Queen Charlotte of Britain, was sent to a convent after suffering what her family called a nervous breakdown. In truth, she likely had schizophrenia, triggered by stress and genetic predisposition. In these smaller courts there were fewer resources, less tolerance for deviance, and even less privacy. Royal women were watched constantly, by servants, advisors, and family. Any deviation from duty was labeled scandalous, any sickness treated as sin. And yet, despite this, many of these women left behind quiet legacies. Some became writers, composing poetry about their inner worlds. Others became patrons of hospitals or artists. Their names may not grace history books, but their suffering, and their quiet strength, echoes still. To be a royal daughter was to be a vessel, for alliances, for heirs, for dynasties. Fertility was not a private matter, it was a public expectation, and it came at a cost. Childbirth was dangerous for all women before modern medicine, but it was particularly perilous for royal women, who were often married young, subjected to frequent pregnancies, and under constant pressure to produce male heirs. Every miscarriage was a political failure, every stillbirth, a national crisis. Take Princess Charlotte of Wales, only child of George IV, and Caroline of Brunswick. Charlotte was the hope of the British monarchy, bright, intelligent, and beloved by the people. She married Prince Leopold and became pregnant soon after, but after a grueling 50-hour labor, she gave birth to a stillborn son. Hours later, Charlotte died from postpartum hemorrhage at just 21. Her death was a national tragedy. The nation went into mourning. The crown, desperate for heirs, eventually turned to her cousins, one of whom would father Queen Victoria. Elsewhere, Queen Isabella II of Spain gave birth to 12 children. Only 5 survived past infancy. Each pregnancy left her weaker. She suffered from anemia, uterine infections, and recurring fevers. But stopping was not an option. As queen, her value was tied to her fertility. Her daughter, Infanta Maria del Pilar, was born with clubfoot and required painful treatments. The condition may have been genetic, a result of the Habsburg line's final years. Maria's later years were spent in seclusion. Repeated childbirth also caused uterine prolapse, a condition where internal organs shift downward due to weak muscles. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, reportedly suffered from this after her 4th pregnancy. She began traveling compulsively, seeking relief in warm baths and avoiding the court's gaze. Even beyond the physical toll, there was emotional trauma. Many royal women watched child after child die from illness, often preventable by today's standards. They were expected to smile, to try again, to fulfill their duty. Their grief was often private. Letters from these women speak of melancholy, longing, and emptiness. But public mourning was limited. A princess did not get to collapse. She got to curtsy, to conceive again, and to hope the next baby lived. Mental illness, so often misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or hidden behind closed doors, was a quiet epidemic among Europe's royal daughters. Generations of tightly woven bloodlines, emotional repression, and immense pressure contributed to a legacy of silent suffering. Let's begin with Queen Maria I of Portugal, sometimes called Maria the Mad. She was intelligent and devout, known early in life for her piety and compassion. But after the deaths of her husband and eldest son within a short span, her mental state deteriorated rapidly. She suffered from delusions, hallucinations, and deep depression. Eventually, her younger son declared her unfit to rule. For years, she remained secluded, treated with rudimentary therapies, cold baths, isolation, and religious readings. In Bavaria, Princess Alexandra, daughter of King Ludwig I, was also afflicted. Described as melancholy from a young age, she had fits of silence, followed by sudden rages. She was frequently confined to her room. Her condition worsened after being forced into a marriage she didn't want, and eventually, she was removed from court altogether. Another tragic figure was Princess Charlotte of Belgium, wife of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. After her husband's execution, Charlotte experienced a severe psychological collapse. She returned to Europe and lived the rest of her life in seclusion, often speaking to her dead husband and writing letters to world leaders pleading for his release, decades after his death. Her condition, likely a form of psychosis, remained untreated. Even those not institutionalized carried the scars of anxiety, grief, and repressed emotion. Princess Louise of Great Britain, daughter of Queen Victoria, was known to have mood swings and intense anxiety. Her need for independence was often interpreted as instability. When she pushed back against tradition, wanting to marry outside of royalty, it was seen as a mental defect, not a desire for happiness. Treatments for mental illness were often barbaric by modern standards. Women were subjected to forced fasting, bloodletting, mercury pills, and even sexual abstinence as a form of discipline. Others were simply silenced. A daughter showing signs of distress could be labeled hysterical, locked in a wing of the palace, or quietly sent to a convent or countryside manor. In royal circles, appearances were everything, and the appearance of sanity, of calm, composed, fertile womanhood, was more important than truth. As a result, countless women suffered alone, misunderstood, and misrepresented in history. By the turn of the 20th century, royal inbreeding was becoming more widely recognized as a risk, not a benefit. Advances in medical science, particularly in genetics, were beginning to illuminate the consequences of centuries of cousin marriage and limited gene pools. But it was too late for many. Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain. At the time, hemophilia was still seen as a mysterious curse, not a genetic trait. When their first son began showing symptoms, bruising easily, bleeding uncontrollably, the Spanish court turned on her. She was blamed for tainting the bloodline. Rumors spread. She was mocked in the press, and her relationship with Alfonso soured. Though she bore 7 children, the marriage was strained, and ultimately loveless. She lived much of her life in quiet exile. Meanwhile, her cousin, Princess Alexandra of Hanover, married the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She was physically frail and suffered from curvature of the spine, a condition likely linked to shared ancestry. She bore children, but her own health deteriorated rapidly. By age 35, she had developed a form of early-onset arthritis, and was largely bedridden. As empires fell, Russia, Austria, Germany, and eventually Spain, the royal daughters caught in their final chapters bore the weight of unraveling traditions. Archduchess Elizabeth of Austria, granddaughter of Empress Sisi, found herself without a throne. She married a minor noble, left behind royal titles, and sought a quieter life. Others, like Princess Alice of Battenberg, mother to Prince Philip of England, struggled with severe mental illness. Alice was diagnosed with schizophrenia in the 1930s and institutionalized. She later recovered, dedicating her life to nursing and founding a Greek religious order. By the 1940s and 50s, royal families across Europe were marrying further afield. Genetic counseling became a quiet norm. Cousin marriages, once standard, became rare, but the damage, physical, emotional, and historical, had already been done. These final generations of royal daughters saw the twilight of monarchy as the center of power. And while they gained more autonomy in choosing husbands, they still lived in the long shadows cast by centuries of genetic obsession. Today, the legacy of inbreeding in Europe's royal houses isn't just a topic for historians, it's a cautionary tale, a footnote in the history of genetics, and a silent ghost that still lingers in archives, paintings, and DNA studies. Many of the daughters we've met tonight are largely forgotten, overshadowed by their fathers, brothers, or infamous husbands. But their lives tell us more about power and fragility than any battlefield or treaty ever could. These women were raised to embody perfection, symbols of diplomacy, purity, and grace. But behind their public roles were bodies racked by miscarriages, joints misshapen by arthritis, jaws malformed by Habsburg lineage, and minds frayed by relentless anxiety. For centuries, a princess's primary value was her womb, Her ability to produce children, especially sons, was her currency. Her health, happiness, and personal desires were secondary. The goal was continuity of bloodlines. Ironically, the more they tried to preserve the royal blood, the more that blood failed them. Scientists today have studied the genetic collapse of the Habsburgs and other dynasties. The inbreeding coefficient of Charles II of Spain is often cited as one of the highest in recorded history, equivalent to the offspring of a brother-sister union. That collapse didn't happen overnight. It took centuries. And each generation of royal daughters carried a heavier biological load. But there's another legacy. One not captured in genetics, but in resilience. Despite their isolation, their pain, their constraints, many of these women found ways to leave a mark. They supported the arts. They funded hospitals. They wrote letters, memoirs, and prayers. Some, like Queen Victoria's daughters, became nurses. Others founded orphanages, convents, and schools. Their influence wasn't loud. It was whispered, stitched into the seams of society, like the hems of the gowns they wore. And in remembering them, not just as symbols but as people, we honor the lives that were overshadowed by duty. Today, European royals marry for love more often than politics. DNA testing is common. Genetic disorders are understood and treated. But we still tell their stories. Not to judge but to understand. Walk through any European art museum and you'll see them. Serene princesses with delicate hands, flowing gowns, and eyes that follow you silently from gilded frames. These portraits were not just art, they were propaganda. And they rarely told the truth. Royal daughters were often painted at their most ideal moment, youthful, glowing, and healthy. The reality was often far more tragic. Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia of Spain, daughter of Philip II, was often depicted as elegant and divine. But behind the brushstrokes was a woman, suffering from chronic digestive disorders and severe anxiety. She fainted regularly, and had recurring fevers. The portraits, however, made no mention of her decline. Princess Elizabeth of France, daughter of Louis XV, was drawn as the epitome of youthful beauty. In reality, she had a clubfoot, hidden under voluminous skirts. She also struggled with what modern historians suspect was severe scoliosis, curved posture cleverly masked in paintings. Painters were paid not to capture reality, but to sell a vision of stability and divine order. Crooked teeth became delicate smiles. Swollen joints were tucked behind fabrics. Yellowed skin was brushed pink with health. The portraits were soothing lies in oil and canvas. And yet sometimes the truth slipped in. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a result of severe inbreeding, was impossible to erase completely. In some portraits of Margaret Theresa and Maria Anna, the protruding lower jaw remains. A subtle reminder of what the lineage had become. Royal daughters were often highly educated, fluent in several languages, schooled in music, philosophy, and etiquette. But for all their learning, they had little power over their own lives. Princess Louise of Prussia, for example, could recite Goethe and translate Latin before she was 14. But she was married off to a man twice her age to secure a treaty. Her education became a decorative skill, not a tool of empowerment. Maria Christina of Austria, another daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, was particularly gifted. She loved drawing and mathematics and was considered one of the most intelligent of her siblings. She begged her mother to marry for love, and was granted the rare right to do so. Yet her political influence remained limited. Her artistic pursuits were tolerated, but not celebrated. Many of these daughters wrote poetry, studied theology, and read philosophical texts by candlelight. But their letters often reveal a shared grief. Knowledge without freedom, intelligence without agency. For every accomplished royal woman like Catherine the Great, there were dozens who lived in gilded cages, brilliant, but bound by birth. Religion was ever present in the lives of royal daughters. It was both a source of comfort and a burden of control. Most were raised with strict Catholic or Protestant teachings that shaped their sense of identity, duty, and sin. When illness struck, it was seen not as genetics, but as divine punishment. Queen Juana of Castile, known cruelly as Juana la Loca, was deeply religious. After the death of her husband, she wandered with his corpse, reportedly speaking to it, and sleeping beside it. Was she grieving? Psychotic? Or was her behavior the result of years of religious indoctrination, paired with genetic instability? Many royal women were taught to see their bodies as vessels of sin. Pain was to be endured, suffering made them holy, infertility was shameful, miscarriage was divine wrath. It was easier to believe this than to accept that their bloodlines were collapsing under their own weight. Some took refuge in religion. Elizabeth of Hungary, though not a direct victim of inbreeding, became a saint after turning to a life of extreme charity and self-denial. Others were forced into convents when they became useless to political marriages, brides who couldn't bear heirs, or daughters deemed too fragile. Faith was everywhere. But for many royal daughters, it offered more guilt than grace. Though raised in isolation, royal daughters across Europe shared a strange, unspoken bond, a kind of sisterhood rooted in shared fate. They were often sent away at a young age, married into foreign courts where they didn't speak the language or understand the customs. Homesick and frightened, they wrote letters, long, emotional documents sent across borders to sisters, cousins, and mothers. These letters reveal the emotional infrastructure they built with each other. Marie Antoinette wrote tearfully to her mother and sisters in Austria, describing the cold indifference of Versailles. Princess Alice of Britain corresponded frequently with her sisters, trading advice on childbirth, court etiquette, and how to deal with overbearing husbands. Though scattered across Europe, they faced the same things: arranged marriages, the terror of childbirth, grief for lost children, and the strain of public life. Few understood them, but they understood each other. Some even saw their sisters die young, aware that they might be next. The death of a royal daughter was often followed by silence in the palace, a portrait draped in black, and the quiet repurposing of her wardrobe for another wedding. Their lives were lonely, but they were never truly alone in their suffering. Although modern royal families have largely abandoned cousin marriage, the genetic legacy lingers. Scientists have studied the DNA of modern European royals and found lingering signs of inherited vulnerabilities. But beyond biology, the emotional patterns have endured. The pressure to appear perfect, the pain of public scrutiny, the fear of failing to produce heirs. Even today, royal women are expected to balance tradition, femininity, fertility, and media attention. Though they marry for love, they still walk in the long shadow of their predecessors. The story of inbreeding, and its consequences, isn't just about the past. It's about how systems, when left unquestioned, can quietly destroy the very people they were meant to protect. It's about the importance of agency, choice, and autonomy. In the quiet lives of Europe's royal daughters, we find echoes of resilience, but also warnings. Their bodies became battlegrounds, their minds, casualties of inheritance and expectation. And yet, they endured. They left behind art, letters, children, and legacies. Some broken, yes, but not erased. And now, as we return from the candlelit halls of history, from the marble staircases and velvet drapes, from the bedrooms where royal daughters once cried quietly into embroidered pillows, we pause. You've met women who were praised in paintings but forgotten in life. Women who bore children until they could bear no more. Women whose illnesses were treated with whispers, whose grief was labeled hysteria. Women who did not choose their lives, but lived them anyway. They lived in castles, but not by choice. They wore crowns, but they were heavy. They smiled for portraits, but often through pain. Their names may not appear on monuments or schoolbooks, but they lived, and they mattered. Now in the quiet of night, you can let their stories settle like dust on the pages of an old book. You are not in a drafty palace or beneath the weight of empire. You are safe. You are warm. You are free. Let the echoes of their lives drift softly through your mind. You need not remember every name. It is enough to remember they lived, that they loved, that they endured. Sleep well, knowing that even among queens and princesses the deepest strength was often silent. And now in silence you may rest. Good night.